Elijah Brooks went for coffee and was insulted by employees and the end of firing the Embezzlers. What if the man sipping coffee next to you was actually your boss, and you had no idea Elijah Brooks, the silent powerhouse behind a multi-million-dollar coffee empire, walked into his own store just looking for a simple cup of coffee? But instead, what he got was disrespect, watered-down brews, and a shocking betrayal brewing behind the counter. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He just watched and took notes. What happened next? Let's just say some people didn't realize they were serving the man who signs their paychecks. And when the truth came out, the fallout was explosive. Shaquille, Big Shaq, had always prided himself on building something from nothing. 10 years ago, he had opened Prime Brew, a small coffee shop in the heart of downtown. His goal was simple: provide the best coffee in the city served by friendly baristas in a welcoming space. What started as a modest venture quickly blossomed into a multi-store empire known for its top-tier coffee and unparalleled service. Prime Brew was no longer just a coffee shop. It was a brand people came from all over just to taste. The rich, aromatic cups of coffee that were brewed with only the finest ingredients. Shaq had spent years perfecting the formula, developing loyal customers who appreciated both the product and the culture he had fostered. But recently, things had taken a turn for the worse. Complaints were coming in faster than Shaq could handle. Customers who once raved about the quality of Prime Brew's coffee were now grumbling about weak, flavorless drinks. The baristas, once energetic and passionate about their craft, seemed disinterested, if not outright careless. There was a growing sense that something was wrong inside the company, and Shaq could no longer ignore it. The tipping point came one dreary Tuesday afternoon when Shaq received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Prime Brew is being sabotaged from the inside. If you don't act now, it'll collapse." Shaq's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he read the short, cryptic message. "I don't know how much longer you have before it all falls apart. Your company is being undermined, and it's coming from within. If you want to save Prime Brew, you need to figure out who's behind it before it's too late." His heart raced as he processed the words. Could it be true? Was someone inside the company deliberately sabotaging everything he had worked so hard to build? He had built Prime Brew from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it down without a fight. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Shaq knew the only way to truly understand what was happening was to go undercover. He had to see things with his own eyes. No more boardroom meetings, no more corporate jargon. It was time to visit his stores as a regular customer and figure out what was going on behind the scenes. The next morning, Shaw dressed in a plain hoodie and cap, keeping his identity a secret. He drove to the downtown store, the flagship location that had been the heart of Prime Brew for years. As he walked through the door, he was immediately struck by the absence of the familiar energy. The hustle and bustle that had once defined the space was now replaced by a quiet, uncomfortable stillness. The cashier, a young woman with disheveled hair and a bored expression, didn't even look up when Shaq walked to the counter. Normally, Prime Brew was known for its welcoming service, but this woman didn't seem to care whether he was a customer or not. Shaq made a mental note of it, but he didn't let it show on his face. He ordered an Americano, his usual, when the barista handed it. To him, he could tell immediately something was off. The coffee was lukewarm and watery, lacking the rich flavor that Prime Brew had become famous for. He took another sip, trying to convince himself it was just a bad batch. But no, this wasn't just a bad batch. This was something worse. As he watched the barista prepare drinks, he noticed something else that sent a chill down his spine. He saw them using strange, cheap-looking ingredients. The beans were a dull shade of brown, not the deep, glossy hue that Prime BRW signature blend was known for. The milk was an off-white color, not the creamy texture that Shaq had spent years perfecting. It was clear that the quality of the product was being compromised, and Shaq felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Someone was trying to bring down prime brew from the inside. Shock's mind raced as he stepped back from the counter, clutching the cup of Americano that tasted nothing like the rich, bold brew prime brew was known for. The more he thought about the anonymous email, the more convinced he became that something sinister was happening inside his company. But how deep did the rot go, and who could he trust? The only way to find out was to dig deeper, and for that he had to remain unseen, blending into the background like any other customer. For the next few weeks, Shaq took to visiting his stores in plain clothes, dressed as an ordinary man with no connection to prime brew. The first visit had shaken him to his core, but he knew he had to keep going. He couldn't risk alerting anyone that he was on to them. The stakes were too high. Prime brew wasn't just his business, it was his legacy. The coffee empire he had painstakingly built over the last decade could all come crashing down if he didn't get a handle on the situation. It wasn't easy. Shaq wasn't used to being anonymous as the owner of Prime Brew. He had always been a figurehead, someone who walked into his stores and was greeted by loyal employees and happy customers. But now, as he slipped through the doors of each new location, he was just another face in the crowd. One evening, he arrived at the next store on his list, a small yet bustling location on the corner of a busy street. The store had once been a hub of energy where the scent of freshly ground coffee and the hum of friendly conversations filled the air. But now, as Shaq stepped inside, it felt lifeless. The usual warmth and inviting atmosphere were gone, replaced by a sense of monotony. The baristas were moving in slow motion, their eyes glazed over as they mechanically prepared drinks. There was no joy in their movements, no passion in their service. Shaq felt a pang of disappointment in his chest. This was not the prime brew he had worked so hard to build. He walked up to the counter, ordering a simple black coffee. This time, nothing fancy. The cashier, a young man with a disinterested expression, handed him the cup. Without even bothering to make eye contact, he had expected to receive the same poor quality coffee he had gotten earlier. But what he sipped was even worse, watery, almost flavorless, with an aftertaste that lingered like burnt plastic. Shaw scanned the room, his eyes flicking over the other customers. There was an elderly woman sitting in the corner stirring her coffee slowly as she stared blankly out the window. A young couple huddled together at a table, each glued to their phone, barely speaking to one another. The once thriving hub of activity now felt cold and disconnected. He couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was a trend. The quality of the coffee had plummeted, the service had tanked, and the soul of the business was slowly fading away. Shaq knew that he had to get to the bottom of it, and fast. But where to begin? As he took a seat by the window, Shaq noticed something strange happening at the counter. The barista, a lanky man with a bored look on his face, was preparing a cappuccino, but instead of using the high-quality espresso beans that Prime Brew was famous for, he reached for a bag of cheap off-brand coffee. Shaw's stomach churned as he watched the barista tamp the grounds into the portafilter. It was a sloppy, rushed motion, like he didn't care at all when the cappuccino was served. The foam was uneven and flat. Shaq could tell just by looking at it that it wasn't up to standard. The milk was scalded, and the coffee had a bitter, burnt taste. It was a stark contrast to the smooth, rich flavors that Prime Brew customers had come to expect. But the worst part was that no one seemed to care. The customers didn't seem to notice the poor quality of their drinks, and the employees didn't seem to be bothered by it. It was as if they had all become numb to the decline of the brand they were supposed to represent. Shaq's mind raced as he processed what he had seen. This wasn't just a case of bad luck or a few mistakes. No, something much darker was happening here. It was as if someone or something was deliberately undermining the very essence of Prime Brew. The ingredients were being swapped for inferior substitutes. The coffee was being brewed poorly, and the staff seemed demotivated, as if they had given up on caring. As he finished his drink, Shaq made a mental note to visit more stores over the next few days. He couldn't let this continue. He had to uncover the source of the problem But he also knew he had to be careful. Whoever was behind this sabotage was clearly very calculated, and they would likely be watching back in his car. Shaq reflected on the day's events. He had to admit to himself that the situation was worse than he had imagined. The quality control issues were just the tip of the iceberg. If he didn't act soon, Prime Brew could very well fall apart at the seams. He couldn't let that happen. The next step was clear. He needed to get more information. He couldn't continue this investigation alone. It was time to bring in someone who had experience in handling these kinds of situations. Someone who could help him root out the culprit. No matter how deep the conspiracy ran. But for now, he would keep his cover intact. Shaq couldn't risk blowing his secret investigation before he had the full picture. The fate of Prime Brew rested on his shoulders, and he wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. Shaq couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something more insidious was happening at Prime Brew after his visit to the downtown store. He had spent the next several days visiting other locations, slipping in and out unnoticed, observing the telltale signs of something terribly wrong. Every store he visited revealed the same disturbing pattern: poor service, bad coffee, and employees who seemed utterly disconnected from the once vibrant atmosphere that had defined Prime Brew for years. As he continued his covert visits, the evidence became undeniable. Each store was suffering from the same fatal flaws. Baristas had lost their passion for crafting perfect cups of coffee. Their movements sluggish and indifferent. Cashiers no longer greeted customers with the warmth and enthusiasm that had once been the hallmark of Prime Brew. The quality of the coffee itself was now consistently subpar. The rich, bold flavors that Prime Brew had built its reputation on were nowhere to be found. Instead, Shaw tasted weak, watered-down drinks that left an aftertaste of disappointment. It wasn't just one or two stores either. Every location Shaw visited seemed to be operating under the same glaring set of problems. In one store, the espresso machine was filthy with dark coffee stains that had been left to accumulate for days. In another, Shaq watched a barista fumble through the preparation of a cappuccino using a cheap off-brand coffee instead of the premium beans that Prime Brew had always prided itself on. The more he saw, the more it became clear these were not mistakes. This was a deliberate effort to sabotage Prime Brew from within, but who was behind it, and why? Shaw's suspicion grew stronger. With each passing day, he began to feel as if he was uncovering a web of corruption stretching all the way to the top. Someone close to him was pulling the strings, orchestrating the downfall of the very business he had worked so hard to build. But who was it? A disgruntled employee? Or was there something even more sinister at play? One evening, after visiting another store in a quieter neighborhood, Shaq sat in his car, staring at the lit windows of Prime Brew. The streetlights outside cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the storefront, once vibrant and welcoming, now appeared cold and uninviting. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration building within him. He had seen enough. He couldn't just keep visiting stores and hoping the situation would improve on its own. He had to take action. He had to confront the root of the problem head on. It was time to start putting the pieces together. As he reviewed his observations, something clicked. The pattern wasn't just about poor service and bad coffee. It was about the ingredients everywhere he went. Shaq had noticed that the coffee beans were cheap, the milk was subpar, and the syrups used for flavor drinks had an artificial taste to them. These weren't small mistakes. This was a coordinated effort to replace Prime Brew's premium ingredients with inferior ones. And it was happening in every store he visited. He recalled his first visit to the downtown store where he had witnessed a barista using a bag of off-brand beans. The taste of the coffee had been weak and flavorless, a far cry from the rich, complex brews Prime Brew was known for. Shaw had been willing to chalk it up to a single bad experience, but now he knew it was part of a much larger problem. It was as if someone had deliberately chosen to downgrade the quality of every aspect of the coffee-making process. Shaq couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anger. This was more than just bad business practices. This was a betrayal of everything Prime Brew stood for. He had built this company from the ground up, pouring his heart and soul into it. And now it was being torn apart from the inside. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fall into place, but there was still one key question: who was orchestrating the sabotage? It seemed clear that the damage wasn't just the result of careless employees. Someone at a higher level was pulling the strings. The question was, who? Shaq's mind began to drift back to the people he had worked with over the years. The managers, the regional directors, the suppliers. He thought about the meetings, the decisions, and the people he had trusted. One name stood out. Trent Wallace Carter was the regional operations director, a man who had been with a brew since its early days. He was responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations of several stores in the region, and Shaq had always considered him a reliable, if somewhat abrasive, member of the A team. But lately, something had felt off about Carter. He had been pushing for cost-cutting measures, suggesting that Prime Brew switch to cheaper ingredients and streamline its operations to increase profits. Shaq had dismissed it at the time. You're chalking it up to Carter's focus on efficiency. But now, in light of everything that had happened, shock couldn't shake the feeling that Carter had been laying the groundwork for this sabotage all along. It wasn't just the push for cheaper ingredients. It was the way Carter had been dismissing the concerns of the employees. Shaq remembered a meeting they had a few months ago where Carter had brushed aside complaints from the baristas about the quality of the beans and the milk. At the time, Shaq had assumed it was just a miscommunication, but now he realized it was part of a bigger plan to destroy Prime Brew from within. Shaq's thoughts turned dark as he considered the possibility that Carter might be the one behind the sabotage. But why? What could he possibly gain from tearing down the company that had been his livelihood for so long? Was he trying to take control, or was someone else pulling his strings? Shaq knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let this continue. He had to confront Carter, but he also needed more evidence to back up his suspicions. He had to be careful. If Carter was indeed behind the sabotage, he would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the city, Shaq made a decision. He would need to get close to Carter, find out what he knew, and see if he could uncover the full extent of the conspiracy before it was too late. The clock was ticking, and the future of Prime Brew depended on the choices Shaq made in the days ahead. Shaq had never liked Trent Wallace from the moment they had met. There was something about the man that rubbed him the wrong way. Carter had been a necessary evil for the expansion of Prime Brew. He had the experience and the drive to help manage the growing number of stores. He was competent, if a bit abrasive, and he had always pushed for higher profits, sometimes at the cost of quality. Shaq had never been thrilled with Carter's relentless pursuit of cost measures, but he had allowed it, trusting that Carter knew what he was doing. But now, after weeks of covert visits to the stores and seeing the rapid decline in quality, Shaq was starting to feel the weight of his mistakes. If anyone had the motive and the means to orchestrate the destruction of Prime Brew, it was Carter. He had always been the one to push for the cheapest ingredients, for the slashing of costs, and for the streamlining of operations that didn't always prioritize quality or customer satisfaction. Shaq's suspicions only grew when he received word from his most trusted employees. One of them, a barista named Naomi Carter, had privately handed him a video, an unspoken plea for help. The footage showed Carter in one of the stores pacing back and forth in front of a group of baristas, his voice cold and threatening. If you don't use the cheaper beans, if you don't cut back on the milk, then you can forget about your job. Carter had sneered in the video. We're making changes around here. This company doesn't exist to serve customers. It exists to make money. And if you don't like that, you can leave. The video was a smoking gun. It was clear evidence that Carter had been forcing his employees to sabotage the very products they had once worked so hard to perfect. It was one thing to push for cost-cutting, but it was something entirely different to openly threaten and manipulate the staff. In this way, Shaq knew that he couldn't let Carter get away with this, but he also knew that confronting him head-on without solid proof would be a mistake. He needed to build his case first. The more Shaq thought about it, the more he realized that Carter had always been a man driven by ego. His smug demeanor, his inflated sense of self-importance. Everything about him screamed that he thought he was untouchable. Carter had always acted like he was the one in charge, the one who held the keys to Prime Brew's future. And now Shaq saw that this arrogance might be the key to taking him down. Shaq had to be careful, though. If Carter had been behind the sabotage for this long, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. The last thing Shaq wanted was to provoke Carter prematurely. He needed to gather more evidence to understand exactly how far the conspiracy went, and to do that, he had to get closer to Carter, much closer. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Shaq had learned through a few discreet conversations that Carter was planning a private meeting with the board of directors to present his vision for the company. It was clear from the rumors circulating that Carter was positioning himself to take full control of the company, or at least to secure his place as the man who saved Prime Brew. Shaq couldn't let that happen. He had to be there to hear what Carter had to say, and more importantly, to confront him with the evidence he had gathered. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon in one of the conference rooms at Prime Brew's corporate headquarters. Shaq wasn't supposed to attend, but he couldn't risk leaving it to chance. He needed to see Carter in action. He needed to hear him speak, to understand just how deeply his greed had tainted the company. So once again, Shaq decided to go undercover, this time as an observer, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, but someone who could make all the difference. Thursday afternoon arrived, and Shaq walked into the corporate building dressed in a sharp suit, his disguise carefully constructed. He knew that Carter would recognize him if he walked. Walked in as himself, so he kept his head down, his posture relaxed, and his demeanor neutral as he stepped into the conference room. The air was thick with tension. The board members were already seated, whispering amongst themselves as they waited for the meeting to begin. Carter was at the head of the table, flipping through a stack of papers, his signature smirk on full display. Shaq took a seat at the back of the room, careful not to draw attention to himself. He could hear Carter's voice cutting through the hushed conversations, explaining his plans to restructure the company and cut costs. The board members nodded along, some more enthusiastically than others, but all of them clearly listening to Carter's every word. Shaw's gaze was fixed on Carter, studying him. Carefully, the man had always been a master of manipulation, able to charm and intimidate in equal measure. But today, there was something different about him. His usual smug confidence seemed more like a mask than ever before. Shaq knew that Carter was hiding something, and it wasn't just his disregard for quality. It was something darker, more calculating. He could see it in the way Carter's eyes darted around the room, as if he was constantly on edge, watching for any signs of rebellion. He had a reputation for being ruthless, but Shaq had never seen him this nervous before. And then it happened. Carter began to speak, his voice rising with fervor as he outlined his plans for the future of Prime Brew. "We don't have the luxury of sentimentality anymore," he declared, looking directly at the board members. "We need to make cuts. We need to prioritize profits. We need to stop thinking about the customers and start thinking about the bottom line. I'm the only one who understands that. I'm the one who knows how to make this company work." Shaw's blood ran cold as he listened to Carter's words. This wasn't just about cost-cutting. This was about control. Carter wanted to reshape Prime Brew in his image, one where quality, tradition, and the customer needs were secondary to the pursuit of profit. It was a vision that had no place in the company Shaq had built. As Carter continued to boast about his brilliant strategy, Shaq felt his stomach churn. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Carter was digging his own grave, and Shaq was ready to expose him. But there was one thing left to do before he could confront Carter. Gather the final piece of evidence, and that would come when Carter finally let his guard down. The meeting with the board of directors had confirmed Shaq's worst fears. Trent Wallace was fully committed to destroying Prime Brew from the inside. His vision for the company was a dark one focused solely on profit, with no regard for the quality the employees or the loyal customers who had helped Prime Brew grow into the empire it had become. Shaq knew it was time to take matters into his own hands if Carter was going to send Prime Brew. Shaq was going to make sure that he paid for it. The final piece of the puzzle was hidden in the Prime Brew warehouse. If Carter had been replacing high-quality ingredients with cheaper substandard ones, that's where the evidence would be. Shaq had heard whispers about the warehouse before rumors of old stock being used suppliers, of questionable reputation, and an increasingly alarming disregard for the company's stringent quality control standards. But the whispers were just that. Whispers. Shaq needed solid proof. He needed to see the stock himself. And so one night, under the cover of darkness, Shaq made his move. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of the city, a large, unassuming building that housed much of Prime Brew's inventory. It was the place where the beans, syrups, milk, and all other ingredients were stored. Before being distributed to the stores, as the owner, Shaq had visited the warehouse many times, but never at night. He had always trusted that the operations were being run smoothly. But now, in light of the events that had transpired, he knew better than to assume everything was in order. Shaq drove his car to the warehouse, parking several blocks away to avoid drawing attention. He checked his watch. Midnight, the streets were empty, and the city's usual hum had quieted to a faint echo. It was the perfect time to break in. He moved swiftly and quietly, slipping through the side entrance that led into the loading docks. The door creaked softly as it opened, but Shaq was careful not to make too much noise inside. The warehouse was bathed in a pale, flickering light. From overhead, the aisles were lined with stacked boxes, bags of beans, cartons of milk, crates of syrups. The air was heavy, with the scent of stale coffee and dust. Shaq had come prepared. He knew exactly where to look. His first stop was the section of the warehouse that stored the coffee beans. He moved quickly, scanning the labels of the bags stacked high on the shelves. The beans that Prime Brew had always used were expensive, imported from select regions around the world. The bags had a distinctive label, a deep burgundy color with gold lettering. But as Shaq scanned the shelves, he felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. The beans in the warehouse were not the ones Prime Brew had always used. Instead, the bags were cheap, brightly colored with generic labels that screamed bargain. Shaq reached out, feeling the texture of the bags in his hands. The beans inside were smaller, duller in color, and had a strange, almost rancid smell. This was not the high-quality product Prime Brew's customers were used to. It was a far cry from the rich premium beans that Shaq had painstakingly sourced for years. He moved on to the milk section. Prime Brew had always prided itself on using organic, locally sourced milk. It was a cornerstone of the brand's commitment to quality, but as he pulled open the refrigerated unit, he found cartons of milk that were not even close to the standard Prime Brew had set. The cartons were labeled with a generic brand, and the expiration dates on some of them were shockingly close. The milk looked off the texture slightly thicker than what Prime Brew customers had come to expect. Shaq's stomach churned as he realized just how far Carter had gone to cut corners. Shaq's next stop was the syrup section. Prime Brew flavored drinks had always been made with natural syrups crafted in-house or sourced from reputable suppliers. But what he found in the warehouse was horrifying. The bottles of syrup were cheap, artificial, and cloyingly sweet, with no trace of the depth of flavor that had made Prime Brew's drinks a favorite among customers. These syrups were the kind you'd find in a fast food joint, not in a high-end coffee shop. It was clear that Carter had replaced every aspect of Prime Brews. High-quality ingredients with the cheapest, most substandard alternatives he could find. As Shaq stood in the warehouse, the weight of what he was seeing sank in. This wasn't just a few bad decisions or a series of unfortunate events. This was a calculated effort to destroy the essence of Prime Brew. Carter had systematically replaced the ingredients that had made Prime Brew coffee stand out. He had corrupted the entire supply chain to increase profits regardless of the damage it did to the brand. But then as Shaq continued to take in the scene, something unexpected happened. He heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the cavernous space of the warehouse. Shock froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The last thing he needed was to get caught, snooping around. The footsteps grew closer, and Shaw's mind raced as he tried to find a place to hide. He darted behind a stack of boxes, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped. Shaw peeked around the corner, trying to make out who was there through the dim light. He saw two security guards moving toward the section where he had been looking. They were talking to each other in low voices, unaware of Shaq's presence. But if they discovered him, everything would be over. Shaq had to act quickly. He waited for the guards to pass, and when they did, he moved silently through the aisles. Carefully retracing his steps, he couldn't risk being seen. Now he had what he needed: the proof, the substandard ingredients, the cheap syrups, the rancid milk, and the awful coffee beans were all the evidence he needed to expose Carter's betrayal. Just as he was about to exit through the back door, he heard the guards' voices again, now coming from the other side of the warehouse. His pulse quickened as he glanced around. He had no choice. He bolted, sprinting toward the exit, adrenaline flooding his system. His shoes slapped against the cold concrete floor, echoing in the silent warehouse. The guards were still several aisles away, but Shaq wasn't taking any chances. He reached the door, throwing it open and slipping into the cool night air. He didn't stop running until he was back in his car, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He had the evidence Carter's sabotage was out in the open, but the fight was far from over. Shaq knew that the battle to save Prime Brew was only beginning. Shaq sat in his car, his mind racing as the adrenaline from his narrow escape at the warehouse slowly began to fade. The evidence was in his hands. Evidence that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Trent Wallace had been deliberately sabotaging Prime Brew, the low-quality ingredients, the subpar products, the threatening behavior toward the employees. Everything pointed to Carter. Shaq had seen the truth with his own eyes, and now there was no going back. But the question remained, what now? Carter had been careful, methodical in his actions, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. Shaq knew he couldn't take on this battle alone. He needed reinforcements, people who could help him expose Carter for what he truly was and ensure that the damage done to Prime Brew could be undone. He needed someone with experience in dealing with corporate sabotage, someone who could help him gather the evidence he needed to take Carter down once and for all. Shaw's first call was to Detective Marcus Hale, an old friend from his days growing up in the city. Marcus had always been sharp, a seasoned investigator with a knack for uncovering the truth in even the most complicated of cases. Back when Shaq had started Prime Brew, Marcus had helped him navigate some legal issues, and they had remained in contact ever since. If anyone could help him take down Carter, it was Marcus. He dialed Marcus's number, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel as the phone rang. The line clicked, and Marcus's familiar voice came through. "Shaq, what's going on?" Marcus asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "I need your help." "Marcus," Shaq said, his tone urgent. "I've got a problem, and it's bigger than anything I've ever faced. I need you to look into something for me fast." "All right, slow down. What's going on?" Shaq took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "I think someone inside Prime Brew is sabotaging the company. I've got proof. I was at the warehouse last night, and I found evidence that Trent Wallace, the regional operations director, has been replacing the high-quality ingredients with cheap substitutes. I've got videos of him threatening employees to go along with it. I need your help to build a case against him." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's a pretty serious accusation, Shaq. But if you've got the evidence, I can help. I'll put together a team and start digging into Carter's background. We'll need to move fast, though. If Carter's been running this operation for as long as you say, he's probably got people in high places protecting him." Shaq nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. "I know. That's why I'm counting on you. You're the only one who can help me take him down." "I'll get started right away," Marcus said. "In the meantime, stay safe. You don't know who you're dealing with." I will, Shaq replied, hanging up the phone with Marcus on the case. Shaq felt a slight sense of relief, but there was still a long road ahead. Carter had done more than just undermined the quality of prime BRW products. He had violated the trust of every employee, every customer, and every person who had ever believed in the brand Shaq had built. This was no longer just about saving his company. It was about bringing Carter to justice. Shaq knew that Marcus would be able to dig into Carter's history, uncover any connections he had that could help bring him down. But he also needed to reach out to the people who had been on the front lines, his employees. They were the ones who had seen Carter's behavior firsthand, and many of them had become disillusioned with the company as a result of his actions. It was time to call in the people who still believed in Prime Brew, the ones who wanted to see the company restored to its former glory. Shaq began making calls to his most trusted employees, baristas managers, and anyone else who had shown loyalty to the company over the years. He explained the situation as best he could without revealing too much, and asked them to meet him at the company headquarters later that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Shaq found himself in the conference room surrounded by the people he had trusted to help him turn Prime Brew into the success it had been. There were a few familiar faces: Naomi Carter, the brave barista who had given him the video of Carter threatening the staff; Victor Lane, the manager from the downtown store who had been with the company since the beginning; and Denise Marshall, the regional manager who had always believed in the company's mission of quality above all else. Shaq stood at the front of the room, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. "I've called you all here because we need to act. Trent Wallace has been systematically sabotaging Prime Brew, and I can't do this alone. I need your help to expose him and take him down." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation set in. They had all seen the decline in quality, the unmotivated employees, and the general atmosphere of distrust that had taken hold of the company, but none of them had known just how deep the rot went. Now they had to decide whether they were willing to risk everything to restore Prime Brew to its former glory. "I knew something wasn't right," Naomi Carter said, her voice shaking. "But I never thought it would be Carter. He always acted like he had the best interests of the company at heart. I don't know how we didn't see it before." Victor Lane nodded. "I've been working for Prime Brew for over 5 years. I've seen it all: changes in management, new policies, new people, but I've never seen it like this. Carter changed. He got greedy, and I guess we all just thought he was doing what was best for the company." Shaq looked around the room, his gaze locking with each of their eyes. "We've all been through a lot, but we can't let this continue if we don't act. Now Prime Brew will be gone for good. I need you all to be brave, to stand up and fight for the company we've all built together." The employees exchanged glances, the weight of Shaq's words settling in. After a few moments, Denise Marshall spoke up. "I'm with you, Shaq. We've all seen what's happening, and we're not going to let Carter ruin everything." Shaw's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, we're going to do this together. We'll gather the evidence we need, and with Marcus on the case, we'll take Carter down the room," buzzed with a new energy, the spark of hope reigniting within them. They had a long road ahead, but now they were united. They were ready to fight for Prime Brew, and they were ready to make sure Trent Wallace paid for what he had done. The air was thick with anticipation as Shaq stood at the head of the table, preparing for the most crucial moment in his fight to save Prime Brew. He had finally gathered the evidence, the substandard ingredients, the videos of Carter threatening employees, and the testimony of his loyal staff members. But Shaq knew that all of it would mean nothing unless he could get Carter to reveal his true intentions. The time for covert investigation had passed. Now it was time for confrontation. Shaq had orchestrated the perfect trap for Carter. The board of directors had agreed to a private meeting, a supposedly routine discussion about the future of Prime Brew. Carter, ever the opportunist, believed that this was just another chance for him to push his agenda, to promote his cost-cutting measures, to solidify his position as the driving force behind the company's survival. What he didn't know was that Shaq had a plan in place to catch him in the ACT to expose his sabotage once and for all. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Prime Brew's corporate headquarters Etch had requested. That the board members keep the session small and confidential, ensuring that only those who were truly invested in the future of the company would be present. He had no intention of letting Carter slip through the cracks again. Not after everything he had done. As the board members filed into the room, Shaq took a seat at the head of the table. He had a folder in front of him. Its contents were the culmination of everything he had uncovered in his investigation. Naomi Carter, Victor Lane, and Denise Marshall were scattered around the room, their faces serious, knowing that the next few hours would determine the fate of Prime Brew. Carter arrived a few minutes late as usual, striding into the room with his usual smug grin plastered on his face. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his tie a shade of red that seemed just a bit too bright, too confident. He was the picture of a man who believed he had already won. He was so certain that his plan to take control of Prime Brew was inevitable that he barely noticed Shaq's calm demeanor. Shaq Carter said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I trust you're ready to listen to some ideas that will save this company. We can't keep bleeding money like this. You need to face the facts." Shaq didn't flinch. He simply nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm all ears." "Carter, go ahead. Let's hear your plans." Carter leaned back in his chair, exuding arrogance. "The changes I've implemented so far have been necessary. The cost of high quality ingredients is just too high. We need to lower the price of our products and increase our margins. We need to start thinking about profits over quality." He paused, clearly, savoring his words, waiting for the board members to nod in agreement. Shaq could feel the tension in the room. This was it. This was where he would strike. Carter was practically handing him the rope to hang him with. Shaw had carefully planted the seeds of doubt over the past few weeks, whispering to the board members and showing them the decline in quality, but now with Carter speaking so openly about his intentions, it was time to pull the trigger with a slow, deliberate motion. Shaw slid the folder across the table toward Carter. "You think Prime Brew is about cutting costs and maximizing profits?" Shaw asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of authority. "Let me show you what it looks like when you choose profit over quality." Carter raised an eyebrow, but his grin never wavered as he took the folder. "I'm all for a little presentation, but we both know I've been running this company just fine." The board members watched in silence as Carter flipped open the folder. The moment his eyes fell on the first piece of evidence, the video of him threatening the employees, the smug look on his face faltered, his fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through the footage, the voices of the baristas and the sound of his own menacing words filling the room. "You see," Shaq continued, "I've been doing my homework, Carter. I've visited the stores, I've seen the low-quality ingredients you've been using, and I've seen how you've been forcing our employees to use them. You've replaced the premium beans with cheap alternatives, the organic milk with something barely fit for consumption, and the syrups you've been using, they're nothing more than sugar water with artificial flavoring." Carter's face reddened as he glanced up at Shaq, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. "You don't know what you're talking about. I've done what's necessary to keep this company afloat." Shaq shook his head. "No, Carter. What you've done is destroy everything we built. You've poisoned the company for your own gain, and now you're going to pay for it with a sharp motion." Shaq pressed play on a hidden recorder. The audio filled the room, and Carter's voice echoed through the speakers. "If you don't use the cheaper beans, if you don't cut back on the milk, then you can forget about your job," the recording played, and Carter's own words hung in the air like a guilty confession. "We're making changes around here. This company doesn't exist to serve customers. It exists to make money, and if you don't like that, you can leave the room." Fell silent. The weight of the moment hit Carter like a truck, his confident demeanor Shayed, in an instant, replaced by a cold sweat that dripped down his forehead. He stammered, his voice now uncharacteristically shaky. You can't do this, you don't have the right to, but Shah wasn't finished, no. Carter, you've lost the right to run this company. You've betrayed everyone who worked for Prime Brew, everyone who believed in what we were trying to create, and now you'll face the consequences. The board members, some of whom had once been hesitant about Shaq's accusations, now looked at Carter with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. The trap had worked. Carter had exposed himself, revealing his true nature for everyone to see, just as Carter opened his mouth to protest the door to why. The conference room swung open. Detective Marcus Hale stepped inside, flanked by two uniformed officers, Trent Wallace. Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. You're under arrest for corporate sabotage, theft, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Carter's face twisted in anger and disbelief as the officers moved to cuff him. You can't do this, he shouted. I built this company. I'm the one who saved it. Shaq stood up from his chair, his face hardening as he looked at Carter. No, Carter, you didn't save. Prime Brew, you nearly destroyed it, and now it's time for you to face the music as the officers escorted Carter out of the room. Shaq felt a sense of relief wash over him. The battle wasn't over, but it was a victory, one that had come at great personal cost. Prime Brew was still standing, and with Carter out of the picture, Shaw was one step closer to restoring everything he had worked for. The corporate boardroom was quiet almost eerily, so as the officers escorted Trent Wallace out of the room, his protests echoed down the hallway. But Shaq's mind was already focused on the task at hand. Carter's arrest was only the beginning, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He still had a company to rebuild and employees to reassure. He had to finish what he started. Prime Brew was still on the line, and Shaq wasn't going to let the work he'd poured years into unravel. Because of one man's greed, with Carter being led away, the remaining board members were in stunned silence, trying to process the chain of events that had unfolded before their eyes. Shaq didn't waste any time. He had planned this moment for months, and now it was time to take control of the situation and secure Prime Brew's future. He needed to show the board that he was in charge, and that his vision for the company was what it had always been: quality, integrity, and customer satisfaction. Ladies and gentlemen, Shaq began, his voice firm but calm. What you've just witnessed is the culmination of weeks of investigation and careful planning. Trent Wallace, the man who had been working from the inside to destroy Prime Brew, is now out of the picture. The board members exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of disbelief and relief. They had all been complicit in some way by allowing Carter's actions to continue unchecked for so long, but now they knew the truth. Carter was never the answer to Prime Brew's problems. Shaq continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, his obsession with profits over quality nearly destroyed everything we've built. But I'm here to tell you that Prime Brew is not just a business, it's a community. A community of loyal customers, dedicated employees, and a brand that stands for something bigger than just coffee. We're going to fix this, and we're going to rebuild Prime Brew. The right way. The board members nodded, some looking relieved, others still processing the shock of Carter's arrest. It was clear that they were beginning to see things from Shaq's perspective, but there was still more work to be done. Shaq could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. Carter might be out of the picture, but the damage done to Prime Brew was deep. The company had been bleeding, customers losing loyalty and losing its identity. It wasn't just about the sabotage Carter had orchestrated. It was about restoring the soul of Prime Brew, the sense of community, the commitment to quality, and the passion for serving the best coffee possible. Shaq turned his attention to the next step: clean house. The board members would have to understand that restoring Prime Brew wasn't just about removing Carter. It was about ensuring that no one else in the company could follow in his footsteps. He needed to rid the company of anyone who had supported Carter's plans, anyone who had been complicit in the decline of Prime Brew's values. It was time for a fresh start. He took a deep breath, knowing what had to be done. Effective, immediately. Shaq said, locking eyes with the board members, "I'm terminating the contracts of anyone who played a role in Carter's actions. The managers who allowed these cost-cutting measures to affect the quality of our products, they're gone. If they've compromised the integrity of Prime Brew, they will not be part of its future." A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none dared to challenge Shaq. The writing was on the wall. There was no room for complacency anymore. However, Shaq continued, "I want to be clear. This is not a company built on fear. We are going to rebuild Prime Brew from the ground up, but we're going to do it with the people who believe in what this brand represents. We're going to promote the honest, hardworking employees who have stuck with us through this storm." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, and most importantly, we're going to bring back the quality that made Prime Brew what it is. No more cheap beans, no more watered-down syrups, and no more cutting corners. We're going to rebuild the trust of our customers. We're going to make Prime Brew a name they can rely on. Again. The board members exchanged glances, and slowly the nods of approval began. It was clear that they were starting to understand Shaw's vision, not just as a businessman, but as the heart and soul of Prime Brew. He wasn't just going to let it die, he was going to fight for it, even if it meant starting over from scratch. "Now we need to talk about the public side of things," Shaq said, shifting gears. "Our customers are the ones who've been hurt. Most they've been drinking watered-down coffee, and they've been fed lies about what's been going on behind the scenes. We need a massive PR campaign to let them know that Prime Brew is back better than ever." He looked towards Denise Marshall, the regional manager who had been with the company since the beginning. "Denise Marshall, I want you to lead this campaign. We're going to emphasize transparency. Tell our customers the truth. They've been loyal to us, and now we need to earn that loyalty back." Denise Marshall nodded, her face determined. "We'll get started right away. I'll coordinate with the marketing team, and we'll have a full plan ready by next week." She turned his attention back to the board members. "This is our chance to turn things around, but it's going to take all of us. We can't afford to let this happen again. We have to be vigilant, and we have to be united in our commitment to rebuilding this 5003 company." The tension in the room had lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. Shaq could see it in their eyes. They were ready to support him. They were ready to fight for Prime Brew, and that was all he needed to move forward. As the meeting concluded, Shaq walked out of the room, his heart a little lighter than it had been when he walked in. The battle was far from over. But with Carter gone and the board finally on his side, Shaq felt more confident than ever. That Prime Brew would rise from the ashes in the coming weeks. Shaq worked tirelessly to implement the changes necessary to restore Prime Brew's reputation. He brought back the high-quality ingredients, trained his employees to reignite their passion for coffee, and launched the PR campaign that would let the world know that Prime Brew was back. And slowly but surely, the customers began to return. They could taste the difference. They could feel the change in the air. The soul of Prime Brew was back, and it was stronger than ever. Shaq smiled to himself, knowing that he had fought for what mattered most. Prime Brew was alive, and it was ready to take on whatever the future held. It was late afternoon when Shaq stepped into the flagship Prime Brew store. He stood still for a moment, soaking in the familiar atmosphere, the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee, the rhythmic hum of espresso machines, and the gentle buzz of customers chatting over their drinks for a moment. It felt like nothing had changed, like the world was still running in the way it was meant to. But deep down, Shaq knew that Prime Brew had gone through a transformation that went far beyond what could be seen or smelled. He had fought a battle to take back control of his company, and now it was time to rebuild not just the stores, but the very spirit of Prime Brew. The company had been through so much betrayal, sabotage, and a loss of its core value, but Shaq wasn't ready to give up on the dream he had worked so hard to build. He couldn't not. Now, the first step in the company's rebirth was cleaning house literally and figuratively. Shaq had made it clear to the board that anyone involved in Carter's sabotage scheme would be removed from their positions. He wasn't taking any chances. The loyalty of his employees had been tested, and he needed to ensure that those who had turned a blind eye to Carter's actions were no longer in charge of Prime Brew's future. This meant firing a number of managers and employees who had knowingly or unknowingly facilitated the decline in quality and, in some cases, actively covered up the damage. It wasn't an easy decision. Some of these people had worked for Prime Brew for years, and it broke Shaq's heart to let them go. But the future of Prime Brew was at stake, and he couldn't allow the same mistakes to be made again. The hardest conversation came when Shaq called in the regional managers. They had been the ones who had the most direct influence over the stores, and many of them had been in positions of power for years. Shaq knew that they had been complicit in Carter's decisions. Whether they had actively participated or simply stood by as things went south, it was time for a change, and Shaq wasn't going to sugarcoat it. Denise Marshall, Victor Lane, and I will be leading the charge in cleaning up this mess. Shaw began, his tone direct and firm. If any of you were involved in the sabotage of our ingredients, or if you didn't report issues with quality when you saw them, your position here is no longer tenable. I have no room for complacency. Denise Marshall, the regional manager who had been one of the few loyal to Shaq, had already started working on a new strategy for the stores. She had been instrumental in pulling together the team to restore Prime Brew's reputation, and now she was tasked with overseeing the entire transformation. But the rest of the managers, Shaq knew that many would not be able to stay as the manager sat there. It was clear that some were uncomfortable, others nervous, but no one spoke out. Shaq stood tall, unwavering. It's not about punishment. It's about restoring Prime Brew's integrity. I'm bringing in new leaders, people who care about quality, about customer satisfaction, and about this company's mission. We will rebuild, and we will do it with the right people at the helm. The meeting ended in an uneasy silence. Shaw knew that some of these decisions would make waves, but he also knew they were necessary. Prime Brew couldn't move forward with the same leadership that had allowed the company to descend into chaos. As the days passed, Shaq worked closely with Denise Marshall and Victor Lane to rehire new managers who shared the company's vision. They spent hours vetting candidates, carefully selecting individuals who had a true passion for the coffee industry. And for customer experience, each new hire was a step in the right direction. And slowly, the store culture began to change at the same time. Shaq focused on one of the most important parts of Prime Brew's restoration: the quality of the coffee itself. For too long, the company had compromised on its signature ingredients. It wasn't just about replacing the cheap beans with the premium blends. They had to reintroduce every element that made Prime Brew special: the syrups, the milk, the pastries. All of it needed to be sourced from the highest quality suppliers, and each ingredient had to meet the standards that Prime Brew customers had come to expect. Shaw reestablished relationships with his trusted suppliers. People who had been with Prime Brew from the beginning. He spent hours at the farms, inspecting the beans and personally meeting with the people who produced the products that went into his stores. He was meticulous about every detail, making sure that nothing had been overlooked. He wasn't going to settle for mediocrity, not when Prime Brew's reputation was on the line. Trust is everything, Shaq often reminded Denise Marshall and Victor Lane. We have to earn back the trust of our customers. They've been disappointed, but we will show them that we are committed to bringing the best to the table. To kick off the public-facing aspect of the company's revival, Shaw launched a bold new advertising campaign, Prime Brew is Back. The campaign was designed to highlight the changes made behind the scenes, how the company had rid itself of the corruption, how it had restored its commitment to quality, and how it was now focused on delivering the coffee that customers had once loved. The ads featured images of the coffee being brewed with care, shots of the fresh ingredients, and most importantly, the happy baristas who would once again serve customers with a smile. The campaign was a blend of transparency and optimism, showing that Prime Brew was no longer just about coffee. It was about rebuilding relationships, about restoring faith. At the same time, Shock made sure that the employees felt valued and supported. He knew that they had been through a lot, and rebuilding the company's culture meant addressing their concerns and giving them the tools they needed to succeed new. Training programs were rolled out focused on not just making great coffee, but also creating an environment where employees felt respected and empowered. The true test, however, came when the customers started coming back. Shock was nervous, but he knew it was inevitable. Word of mouth had spread about the changes taking place, and Prime Brew's loyal customers were curious to see if the company really had returned to its roots. The first few days were slow, but then something unexpected happened. Customers started posting about the changes online. They shared their excitement on social media about the quality of the coffee, the smiles of the baristas, and the fresh ingredients. They could taste the difference. They could feel the change. And with that, the crowds began to return. Shaq stood in the corner of one of the stores watching. As a line formed at the counter, he felt a surge of pride. The battle had been long and difficult, but Prime Brew was back, was alive again, and it was better than ever. The employees were happy. The customers were excited, and Shaq finally could breathe a little easier. He had fought for Prime Brew, and it had paid off. Sometimes it takes one quiet man in a hoodie to remind the world what leadership really looks like. Elijah Brooks didn't raise his voice. He raised the standards. He didn't seek revenge, he sought justice. And in doing so, he reignited a company's soul. But here's the real question. Would you have recognized him? Or would you have served him that bitter cup too? In a world where profit often outweighs principle, are we still paying attention to the human cost? We want to hear from you. Was Elijah right to fire them all? Or could some have been saved? If this story stirred something in, you don't let it end here. Like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Soulful Stories IVA for more real-life tales that hit deeper than headlines. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths, and we're here to tell them all.